Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Suspiria. This film came out in 2018. It was directed by Luca Guadagnino. If you're expecting me to sit here and really praise Guadagnino and his canon of work, it's not going to happen. He's not somebody that I'm a fan of, and it's not to say that I don't think that he has potential to be great, and it's not that I don't think that he has talent. Of course he does. But I think the first film I ever saw of his was I Am Love when that came out, and I remember thinking it was this very, sensual, very sumptuous piece of work, and that's kind of what he's known for in terms of his directorial style. Ultimately, it just felt very self-indulgent without allowing any sort of truth or true heart meaning to come out of it. And of course, Call Me By Your Name is maybe his most successful work thus far, and that's a film that of course was very critically acclaimed and audiences loved it as well. And I will say, I think that of what I've seen, I'd say that's maybe one of his better works, just because I feel like he reined in a lot of that self-indulgence. But regardless, I wasn't a fan of that, and I know that a lot of people thought I was crazy at the time, but yeah, for me, it was very aesthetically driven. I didn't feel the heft of the situations, and I didn't feel an emotional connection to the main characters. Yes, there was a very sensual aspect to it, but it was never three-dimensional, and the story felt empty for me. This film is a major departure from that sort of style. That film is very quiet and, as I said, very picturesque because it takes place in Italy. But this is, of course, a horror film, and while there are things about it that I admire naturally, both aesthetically and even thematically in terms of what they wanted to explore, I still have quite a bit of issues with it. This is, of course, a remake of the 1970s cult horror film Suspiria, which is one of my favorite horror movies, I think, of all time, and I reviewed it quite a while ago, so I'll put the link in the description below. That film also is quite sumptuous, and it is very psychedelic in a lot of ways. It is a coming-of-age story about a young girl kind of transitioning, becoming a woman, and it's done in this very kind of Alice in Wonderland sort of fairy tale with all of these art house elements as well as grindhouse elements. It's got such a broad color palette and just an ear-piercing score that is so badass by the band Goblin. It's the whimsy mixed with the macabre that is what I respond to in that film. It is so paradoxical, and that is classic Dario Argento, who directed the original. This new film, it does follow the same storyline and kind of the same structure for the most part, in a basic sense. It also captures a lot of the essence of the original in a familiar way, which was something that I wasn't really expecting, especially with the self-indulgent filmmaking, the excessive filmmaking, the imagery, and the homage to a lot of filmmaking from the 1970s. But at the same time, this film is really wanting to set itself apart from the original, and I really respect that notion. I think that if you're going to make a remake, you should make it your own and not try to copy what had been previously done. And this is quite a different piece. It explores a lot more, and it attempts to confront more of the complex themes in terms of like maternity and female autonomy and political upheaval. The original film does touch on these ideas for sure, but it's more like they're inferred, they're implied through the imagery. You do see hints of like Nazi Germany imagery, and you see those hints of female sexuality as well. But I like that. I like that in the original film there is a very nightmarish, very macabre quality where a lot of it is in the imagery. So you have to look at the images themselves and kind of figure out what it means for you, because it's not necessarily manifested in the characterization or in the dialogue. And while some people have complained about that aspect of the original, I do think that the storybook quality of it really works, and it works with that particular genre, horror. And ironically, that's what drew me into the film, was the simplicity of it. I do think that in the horror genre specifically, a lot of times less is more. You need something very simple, and you can do a lot with that. You can do a lot with it because horror is so sensory based, so you can play with the imagery and the tone and really have a lot of your themes and ideas kind of be reflected through that. So with this remake of the film, it is different. It's not very colorful, and at first at least there are a lot of grays, and it is kind of minimalistic. It has that kind of 1940s Germany aesthetic, which is strongly enforced. This does take place in 1977 Berlin, and there is more focus in this film on the actual politics, on the corruption and the abuse of power, and how that is mirrored within the dance academy, or I should say the dance company, within the female relationships. This is very much a female-driven film, and in the original film film, it takes place at a ballet school. And in this one, it's a modern dance troupe or a modern dance company, a la Pina Bausch or Martha Graham. I was in a modern dance company as well. So when I was watching this movie, it really made me want to dance again, and it brought back a lot of memories. But I like the addition of the modern dance as opposed to ballet, just because in modern dance, there's a quality to it that is very, very spiritual, very physical and primal, and very earthy. So it's less rigid as something like classical ballet. The sound design, especially, they did a really good job of really capturing the feeling of what modern dance is like. So you're hearing like joints cracking, and you're hearing the floorboards creak as people are dancing on them, and the breaths, the very kind of sensual breaths of Dakota Johnson. The sound and the textural aspect of those dance sequences I thought was handled really well. And yes, with modern dance, there is that abandon, that ritualistic quality to it, which does help the main character, Susie, played by Dakota Johnson, allows her to kind of discover her body, discover her carnal instincts. This film is more body horror rather than like traditional horror, paranormal horror. And I think that fits along with the idea of evolution and the female body. This film does have a lot of imagery that sometimes is a bit too on the nose, but it's a lot of vaginal imagery, a lot of menstrual imagery, and that's kind of contributing to just that feeling of like an egg hatching. Something is building inside. And just as you'd expect, the art direction and everything is so meticulous and very detailed, and you have to appreciate it to an extent. I think that Luca especially has a real grasp of artifice, but not necessarily true art. For him, it's more the arty kind of picturesque sheen that is what is so intoxicating to him. But for me, I find that direction, especially in this film, because it does have a lot going on, it lacks a true core, and it does feel a little bit aimless. The things in the movie that should be compelling us forward, the things that should be progressing the story, to me, really fall flat. It's a mishmash of stylistic choices as well as thematic choices that we've seen before, but I think at a certain point you can get too lost in the metaphors themselves, and there's no sense of being grounded with any sort of spirit or heart. Ultimately, I'm not a fan of just the way the film was directed on a very plain level, but I have a lot of complaints about a lot of Guadagnino films in terms of the way it's directed. But I think that the dance sequences are a perfect example of that. There isn't much dancing in the original, but here they're using that as a major focal point as well as a plot device, because the ritual of dance becomes part of the witch ceremony in a sense. And they're using dance, especially that dance number that they perform towards the end of the film. It's like a mosaic of sorts, kind of tying all these different themes together. And I have to commend the choreographers and the dancers. They really put a lot of effort into making this a very elaborate, very detailed piece. And yet I feel like I couldn't really appreciate the dance or the dancers because the direction of the film in those sequences is just very ineffective. There are so many cuts happening that you don't have a moment to focus your attention on any of the dancers or any of what's going on and allowing it to build. You don't get to see the shapes sort of unfold, or how the dancers relate to one another, or how they relate to their environment and how that relates to the subtext. And that's a complaint I have about the entire film, is that you can't focus on one thing because you are constantly being disoriented by the camera work. There's a rehearsal scene in the movie where Susie is basically put under a spell. And so she performs this dance, or she practices this dance, but her movements, so they're very aggressive. Her movements cause her to physically, very violently hurt another dancer who is in a different room. And Susie, without knowledge, is just destroying this person in such a grotesque sort of way. And there are so many crosscuts happening that I could never really feel it. I could never feel the physicality of this person being disfigured so horribly. It's excessive and confusing, and it doesn't really set a stage for us. It doesn't set a clear tone for us to really follow. Very little of this film felt three-dimensional for me. I always felt like I was blocked off from it, like there was a distance between me and the screen. And honestly, thinking about the score itself, I kind of felt like that contributed to the flattening of the spaces and the flattening of the experience of it. I love Tom York. You guys know I love Tom York, and I'm a huge Radiohead fan, and I honestly, I think I've listened to the soundtrack separately, and I prefer it on its own more than I do in this movie. I think that his sort of electronic, very muted, melancholy style It does. It kind of, it feels disjointed. It doesn't accent anything. It doesn't accent the movements or the imagery or the interpersonal relationships as I believe it should. And that Goblin score from the original, yes, it might be very shrill and sometimes it is really insufferable. I think it works so much better because even if it is kind of slightly overwrought at times, it's so compelling. It enhances the surrealism because it contributes so well to the imagery that's happening on screen. And like I said, I love Tom York, but really, if you're going to do a horror kind of experimental film like this, especially an art house would, you call Johnny Greenwood to do your music. Horror is so much about how it builds. And with Suspiria, even though it begins in a very bombastic sort of way because that is the style of it, the story really builds where the main character, Susie, she's coming into the school. It's a new world for her and she doesn't know anybody and she's nervous and she doesn't know about these people and she has to slowly discover little by little. Whereas in the new version, they don't take any time to really build towards anything. They're established as witches very early on. The politics, the political destruction, the abuse of power, all of that is very literal, as in that wall that Berlin Wall is right outside of the dance studio or the dance company, whatever. And while a lot of that abuse of power and the manipulation and all of that is in the female relationships in particular, it just doesn't, there's never that sense of dread. And I think a lot of it is because we don't have a Susie like in the original that roots us in reality, at least partially. With the original Susie, she really does seem like somebody who is very innocent. And the Dakota Johnson version, she's playing innocent, but yet I don't really buy it. When I first heard that Dakota Johnson was playing the Susie character, I thought that was a really great choice just because she does have that innocence to her and that youthfulness in her face, yet she does have a kind of a sensuality about her and a self-awareness that can be very alluring. And that can be a point of intrigue for her character. She's definitely seemingly less innocent than the Susie character in terms of just the way she's playing the character and the way that or the way even the Guadagnino approaches the character. But I'm not feeling that resist within the character nearly as much. And that, again, is what's paradoxical about it. That's what's compelling. The original Susie was so unaware. So it made it more interesting for us because we're like, wait, what is at the top of that staircase? Who is that person in the corner? What's behind that wall? You have all of these questions and you want to explore this world with her. There are a lot of abstractions and there are a lot of kind of loose themes about women and how they relate to each other or don't relate to each other. And yet it's not woven together in a way that's structurally satisfying. And I do admire the ambition of the project because it is ambitious. You took more of a simple story that hinted at certain things and you really decide, no, we're going to take those ideas and really flesh them out. But it often drags more than it pops as a result. In this version, I think some of the ideas aren't particularly fleshed out like they could have been because there is so much going on. And there is a lot open to interpretation, and that's great. I honestly think that if I talk to someone who's seen the remake, the new Suspiria film, I think we'd have very different ideas about what we saw. And that is a very interesting thing. Maybe if I do revisit this movie, maybe I'll have more appreciation for it. Maybe some of those ideas, some of those metaphors will solidify and they'll have more cohesion for me. Sometimes that does happen. There are times when I see films multiple times and it starts to make more sense to me as something special. But just on an initial viewing, I did just feel weighted down by so much of what was going on. Weighted down by the characters, the subplots, the aesthetic, just the artifice in general, the metaphors. It was just too much. It needed to be reined in. That's my problem with Suspiria and my problem with Guadagnino in general. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.